Welcome, everyone. They're not, they keep talking. Welcome, everyone. Let's get going. Okay, thank you. Yeah, we need somebody to take notes. Can we get a volunteer, please? Volunteers? Notes. Anybody? Come on.
Roy, did you Roy, did you just say that you take notes? What?
I would say gladly take notes.
Awesome. Thanks, Roy. Okay. The note well, a reminder that this applies here. And as you know, this governs everything that we do at the IETF. So please make sure you're familiar with this. Meeting tips. Please make sure to sign in so we know who's and how many people attend this session. Help us for future planning and allows you to join the mic if you want to speak. And for remote participation, please make sure to keep audio and video off unless you want to speak up. Talked about this. This is Mondays, and today's agenda is identity and authorization chain across domains. That Brian will talk about this for 20 minutes. Aaron will be talking about identity assertion authorization grant, and then Neil will be talking about OAuth profile for open public clients, and Leif will finish up with the OAuth status assertions. We still have one more session for Friday. So hope to see you all there. We have package vendor too there, interesting topics too. Okay, so let's get going. Brian. Is Brian here? Ryan. No. No, Brian.
Let's swap.
Okay. Aaron, do you want to go first then? Let's go.
Brian's fixing the typo in his slides.
Do you want to request?
Yes. One moment. Oh, you did it. Shoot. Now I lost it.
You lost?
You lost it? Hold on.
Don't know what happened. Oh. Wait. Really? Brian's not going to present first? It's going to make very little sense without the context of Brian's, but I can go.
Okay.
That's fine. And Peter's not here either?
Are you able to share this?
That's
now?
okay.
So should I share it to me?
They must have forgotten that we have a meeting.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
Okay. It's fine. Okay, hi. I'm Aaron Paragi from Okta. This was supposed to go after the previous presentation because this draft is a profile of the previous document. So instead, you'll hear about the profile first and then hear about the parent document later. Okay, so for this was a picture from Sunday morning at about 5:30 a.m. from 300 feet in the air from Vancouver. So yes, this document is a profile of the OAuth identity and authorization chaining across domains, which is a bit of a mouthful of a name. I'm going to first talk about the problem space that we're trying to work in, and then talk about what this is doing to solve it. For this presentation, I very much have my enterprise hat on as somebody from Okta, so keep that in mind. This is a very much playing in the enterprise IT admin space. So in an enterprise, we configure applications through a single sign-on to the enterprise identity provider. Sometimes using OpenID Connect, sometimes using SAML, sometimes other things. Um, the from an enterprise company's point of view, they have a bunch of different apps that they will use within the company, and they will connect all of those to the enterprise IDP. So you can use a single account to log in. So it might be your wiki app, your chat app, documents, whatever it is. This is great. We like it when they use OpenID Connect. However, there's another part of this picture, which is kind of a less well-solved part of the problem. If you are in one of these applications, sometimes these applications want to get data from other applications in the same workspace. So in this case, we're looking at a wiki page. Somebody has dropped in a link to a chat conversation or whatever it is. This wiki wants to actually show a rich preview of whatever's at that link. And currently, this is what you see. You will see a link with a button that says connect your account. And then this app will go do an OAuth flow to that app to get data. The user is part of that flow. The employee user, right? They're sitting at that screen, click a button, they get sent through an OAuth flow, see a consent screen and everything because it's a third-party application, and they will grant access to data at that application. The problem is that that does not actually accurately reflect the correct ownership of the data, and it's also just a kind of user experience burden in the enterprise context. So we have all these different applications talking to each other to get data from each other, sending users through OAuth flows across each other, and the identity provider that they all use to sign in to those apps doesn't see any of that happening and can't manage it, can't see that it's happened, can't control it, can't enable it, can't disable it. So what we're trying to do is essentially extend the single sign-on experience of signing into these applications to also make that work for API access between the applications, with two main goals of that in mind. One is making it easier for users so that they don't have to go through the OAuth consent screen for every combination of apps they use within their enterprise, and so the enterprise admins can actually manage control of the data that's getting shared between the applications that they use. So that is the main problem space. To solve this, we have taken the previously mentioned but not previously mentioned identity assertion or identity chaining, identity and authorization chaining draft, and profiled it down. So that draft essentially says use token exchange 8673 and then use the JOT authorization grant 7523 to get an access token. We narrow that scope and say the input to the token exchange is an identity assertion rather than like an access token like is commonly used in those use cases. The ID token or SAML assertion gets turned into a new JOT, which expresses the fact that this app is actually allowed to get access to data from this other app, both of which live under the enterprise IDP. That JOT then gets used in a JOT authorization grant to get an access token from the target application. This is another way to look at it. So you have a client, you have this wiki, the user is on this page they drop a link into this other application that's used by the company. That wiki behind the scenes, not visible to the user, is going to first do a token exchange using the ID token that it got when the user signed in up to the IDP. It's going to get this JOT authorization grant, and it's going to send that over to the resource server of the like chat app or whatever it is that it's trying to get data from. And it's saying, hey, this enterprise IDP says that it's okay for me to get an access token to access this data. and then it can respond with an access token. The reason that this can work is because, again, both of these applications have a trust relationship with the enterprise IDP through a single sign-on, so we're able to actually have a complete chain, and everybody involved can know that it's okay for this data sharing to take place. I wanted to talk about this again. This would make more sense if you have previously heard about the identity authorization chaining draft, but the reason that we needed to profile it is because it essentially leaves a lot of things out of scope. So it doesn't say how you get the initial token, and that token in that draft could actually be any kind of token because it's really just saying use token exchange. In this draft, the initial token is obtained through an SSO flow. It is an identity token of some sort, either an ID token or SAML assertion. The way that the trust relationship is established between the two domains is through the SSO relationship that they both already have. And the authorization chaining draft doesn't actually define the semantics of the JOT that is used cross domains, whereas we need to be very explicit about what's in that JOT and why it's okay to trust to issue an access token. So this is essentially what the steps look like. This is at step one. The client goes to the identity provider and says, I'm trying to access this resource, which is the token endpoint of the application is trying to access. This draft defines a requested token type. And then the input to this is also an ID token that it got through SSO. The response, which is a token exchange response, contains this JOT authorization grant with all the defined claims and semantics of what that means. Here we have the lovely NA appearing again, because this is not actually an access token. You can thank Brian for that. He's not here. Should I not hassle him if he's not here?
It's okay.
Okay. This is what the cross-domain JOT looks like. So we have a type defined specific to this, which means that is what this is, because again, cross-JOT confusion and mentioned in the BCP is a real problem, and this is a very essentially giving a lot of power to this token because it can be used directly to go get an access token. So nothing should be particularly surprising in here. It's issued by the identity provider. It's got the user's user ID. One thing to note about the user's user ID and the client ID value is this is particularly tricky because we are trying to make this JOT readable without any transformation by the thing it's getting sent to, which in the example I gave was like the chat app, which it already has a registration of the wiki that's trying to access it through their own OAuth relationship. We want to use that client ID here, so it doesn't have to know anything else. And the user ID that's in this should be the user ID that is from the point of view of the chat app being accessed. So there's no requirement that the user IDs are, the same across everything in this system, because that's not how it works. Like if you go to configure your enterprise SSO, you end up often sending different user IDs to every different application that's being accessed through whatever kind of mappings and whatever reason, for whatever reason. So we're trying to just keep all that architecture the same. Then the client takes this JOT and uses it in a JOT bearer assertion, which is 7523, which this should not look surprising. I did put an authorization header in here because this is very explicitly only useful for, or should only ever be used by confidential clients. This is server to server stuff going on. There's no browser apps. Any browser app is going to be a browser app of one of the resources, one of the apps in the system, not across domain. And then the response would be the regular token response that resource app's token endpoint would return, which does not define access token format or anything. It's whatever it would return. So like if we just say, you're going and talking to the Slack app, whatever Slack already returns as an access token, we're not saying change that, just issue the same thing, right? They've already got OAuth, they're already returning bearer tokens, just do the same thing. We're just giving you a new way to return these tokens. So I am very excited to report we have made a lot of progress in this since the last time we talked about this. Okta has an actual development branch within the actual Okta product that we have some people playing with. It's not public yet, but it is. We're able to grant access to it for people who want to play around with it. And we've started actually scoping out the work to ship this in production for reals. We have been working with Atlassian on a prototype against that IDP for reals, and they are also working on scoping it out to build into production. There's a couple other companies that we've been talking with as well. I can't name them just yet. I'm hoping I will be able to very soon. They're also very excited about implementing this, and yeah, so that is it's a good sign that it is clearly solving problems, not just for us. I actually want to talk a little bit about, I don't have a slide for this one, but I want to talk a little bit about that excitement using this diagram. Um, okay. Let me just make this point, then we'll get to questions. So one of the, so from, I talked about the problem from the enterprise perspective of wanting users to have an easier time and also having the IDP be able to actually control which apps can talk to which. But the other legs in this flow also benefit from enabling this. Like the clients or the resource servers and clients in this flow often, like, you know, they want to build integrations to other applications, and they want those integrations to work well and be easy to use. And currently there just is a lot of friction because they have to send users through these consent flows and figure it all out. And they are very excited about being able to like remove a lot of that friction by using the IDP as the way to mediate who's allowed to do what. So I'm excited that it looks like it's actually solving a problem for multiple people in this ecosystem. And yeah, that was the last slide. So we'll take
Okay.
take questions.
Atul.
Oh, this is tough. Uh, pretty cool stuff. Just a couple of things. I guess you would bind the JOT authorization grant to the requester.
Get closer to the mic.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess you would bind the JOT authorization token to the client because you're going to verify it afterwards so that the IDP knows that it issued the grant to the right requester, right? Um,
Yeah.
Yeah.
That I didn't do a good job of explaining all the claims in it, but yeah.
okay, and then the second question is like in the token exchange, is the client going to request all the different scopes that like all the different parties that it wants to exchange this JOT authorization grant with?
Yeah, good question. So this request is made to one app. So if Atlassian in this example wants to go and talk to Zoom and Slack and whatever, they're going to do this flow for each of those to get a new, because this JOT says which resource it can be used for. So they'll need a new one for each of those. And as for the scope question, that's a different question. We we're not defining any behavior about scope, but we would expect people to follow the existing best practices of like, don't request all the scopes up front. Generally like request as little as you need at any given time, that kind of thing. And you can always go back through and get a new access token when you need to.
George Fletcher, I guess one of the questions I had is it seems it was a little bit confusing to me in the JAG itself as to what the subject is bound to. So like when we think about identity tokens, the subject is a function of the issuer,
Yep.
right? We explicitly called out in transaction tokens that in a transaction token, the subject is a function of the audience because that identifies the trust domain. In this particular case, if the subject identifier is the same subject identifier the IDP would have given the so like I'm on Atlassian and I'm connecting with Slack or whatever. If the subject identifier is the one that the IDP would have given to Slack, right, then you could say that the subject is a function of the client is of the destination entity. Anyway, so I think there's probably some clarity that needs to be put there, so that you don't run into, subject identifier collisions and the right thing happens.
No, I see what you're saying. I'm pretty sure it's correct. Let me go back to the jot. Well, no, in this diagram, maybe it needs to be clarified, but the intent is very much to treat this jot similar to an ID token. So from the resource app's point of view, it's going to get this jot, which has a user ID in it, which is a user ID bound to the issuer, just like an ID tokens is, right? So
Okay.
ID token subject is from the thing receiving it point of view, it should treat that subject as subject at this issuer, right?
Okay.
So we did same thing.
Right, which might be slightly different than if it had been a standard OAuth flow, depending on how that track was happening, because you would have had an extra hop to the IDP out of the OAuth server, and the OAuth server would have assigned its own subject. Anyway, so I can look through it and
Yeah, no, I think I understand what you're saying, and I'm pretty sure it's fine as is.
Okay, it might, because it's not an ID token, we might should explicitly clarify that the subject is is within the domain of the issuer, if that's what you want to happen.
Yeah, and I can't remember if that sentence is in there or not, but I think it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then the other thing had to do with depop binding these things, or it feels a little bit scary in the sense of being, if I can mint one of these authorization grants, right, I'm going to get SSO'd in.
Yeah, I mean, it's
Just one second. We are
Yeah.
running out of time,
Okay.
so if you can
Okay.
quickly answer those. And thanks, George. Go ahead, Justin.
Hi, Justin Richer. So I'm missing a couple of key bits from this diagram. Where does client get, or does client get, an access token for calling authorization server of resource app? Does that comes back from the authorization server of the? Where's step 3 or 4 in the slide?
Yeah. Sorry, so I didn't include the responses in this.
Right. Yeah.
So-
I'm just wondering where that
Yeah,
piece
so
comes.
the response from token exchange is this jot.
Is the grant?
the
Yep,
tag.
I got that.
That is sent in step 2, and
Okay.
then the response of that is the access token from the resource app.
Okay, so the response of 2 is
Yep.
that, and then the AS is basically validating the assertion through the IDP as an assertion provider. That's how that loop closes.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. Okay, so in that case, all right. I understand George's question a little bit better with that, and I do think it does allow this to close the loop a bit, and it also, I guess, answers my second question, which was, why don't we just hand back an access token from the IDP directly? But it looks like we're talking about different trust domains.
Yeah, and
or functionality domains.
We did consider that first, and the very quick conclusion we came to, which has been validated now by multiple people we talked to, was you're never going to get an app like Slack or Zoom to trust an access token at the resource server issued by an IDP.
Right, absolutely.
They're only going to trust the access tokens they've issued.
Right, okay. Thank you.
David.
Hi, David Broussard. I think the answer to Justin's question kind of answers part of mine, but when I saw your other diagram, the spaghetti one, where you're connecting all the apps together, because I'm biased to another authorization model, I was like, oh, hang on a minute, this is a great place where you'd want to put a PDP, and then you'd have essentially a gateway or an interceptor sitting in front of each one of those apps, and they essentially, when the wiki talks to the chat app or the spreadsheet app, there would be an authorization request that would say, hey, can the wiki site consume data from the spreadsheets app on behalf of the user authenticated in the wiki app?
I would think that the IDP could implement that with what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But you would still need the rest of this flow to negotiate the tokens.
You still need the
Because
identity.
like none of the policy is described by this. If that makes sense.
Yeah, you still.
It's all black box in the IDP. Like IDP decides if this request is going to succeed or not, like that first
Right.
request, based on policy, which is not part of the spec. So it could be implemented with that. Yeah.
So is this more of a way to like
Sorry, guys, we're running out of
we
time.
can
We
talk
need,
later.
we need to finish.
Yeah,
like,
we'll talk later.
We need to continue this discussion later. How many people read this document? Show of hand. Just very few. So yeah, if you can get more people to review it, yeah, awesome. Thank you.
For the meeting minute takers was Peter,
And Christina.
someone else?
Christina.
Cool, thanks.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Next one. You wanna talk to that or? You know,
Who is they?
you're already here, so why?
We lost Brian. Is Neil, are you online?
Hello. Am I coming across?
Oh, there's Neil. Great. Yeah, do you want to,
Okay.
how do you want to go with
Who's
this is Neil
Neil?
from,
Okay,
yeah.
yeah.
Okay,
let's do
great.
that.
Great, thanks, Neil. So I'm going to let Neil do most of the talking, but I'm going to be up here to help answer. But this is mostly Neil's draft.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So a few months ago, I sent this to the mailing list, and I'm kind of looking to get adoption. So I'm presenting it here today to kind of kick things off. So this is, I called it an OAuth profile for open public clients. Name's not too important to me. If we can go to the next slide, please, or do I have control of that?
Can you guys hear?
Can you guys
Can you hear
him?
me?
You're like fading in and out for some reason.
Okay,
Neil, I handed you the controls. You can play with.
thank you. Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Kind of.
Kind
It's
of.
fading in and out.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Do you have a different mic you can switch to?
Possibly if I can find the controls to switch the mic.
Seems that the sound is okay online.
Okay.
Oh, people.
Yeah, the remote participants have no issue.
Okay, that's good.
So I don't think it's the mic then. Well, I'll try going forwards. So the problem we're trying to solve is this. The IETF has spent a lot of effort over the years defining standard protocols for accessing your mail, your contacts, your calendars, etc. And unlike the closed ecosystems of most internet services like Facebook and Twitter, this means servers and clients can be built by two completely different people and companies with no knowledge of each other, but still work together. And despite the dominance of Gmail and Outlook, there are still many, many other email servers running out there and dozens of different clients. But the problem is authentication. At the moment, username and password is still the only interoperable method of logging into your account. And that's just not acceptable in 2024. There are lots of email hosts in particular looking to make authentication more secure while retaining ease of use. And the email client authors are keen too, not least because the email hosts keep badgering them about this. So, proposing a solution. Right now, I think the only viable answer is OAuth, but the way it currently works in most email clients is hard-coded to only work with Gmail and Outlook. It requires a pre-registered client ID and a knowledge of what options the host has configured in terms of how they do OAuth. And this doesn't scale to support the whole ecosystem. So last year, Fastmail organized a conference with a bunch of the major vendors in the email server and client space, and we came up with a proposal for an OAuth profile to support this use case. We're deliberately not trying to define anything new. This is just pulling together a bunch of existing OAuth specs and mandating choices for most of the options, so we can have a profile of OAuth that gives both clients and servers something they can implement and know will interoperate without having to have a pre-existing arrangement. So here's a brief overview of how it works. First, we fetch the authorization server metadata to get the endpoints we need. How we get the URL for that is an interesting question, but we can come back to that. Then we get a client ID now the current suggestion is using dynamic client registration. Obviously, this information is untrusted and could be all false. And if the server wants to ignore this, it can just return a static client ID to every client. But I know as an email host myself, we would find this very useful for debugging purposes, if nothing else, and tracking down issues that users might be having with the service. Now, the client can get authorization using the authorization code grant flow once it has the client ID. We've tried to reduce the options to make it secure and easier to be interoperable. So we've mandated PXE using SHA-256 hashing of the code challenge, required issue identification and resource indicators to protect against mix-up attacks. Then if the user grants authorization, we then get back an access token and a refresh token. The client is mandated to not reuse old refresh tokens so servers can detect leaked ones. This is something that we found a lot of clients struggle with, but it's nice if we can enforce it once they've successfully used a new one, never used an old one, then we can tell if it's been duplicated somewhere. So that's the kind of brief overview of kind of how it's meant to work. There are obviously some open questions and some presumptions. So this is meant to pair with auto discovery, and of course we need to define the scopes. I got my flow mixed up here. Yeah, so this is the things that we need to know beforehand. So we would, yeah, auto discovery is a key part of this, and how that would integrate with this is an interesting thing. And then the scopes, there's a number of different options there. One suggestion that I think is quite a good one is just using the JMAP capabilities, because that covers things like access to mail or whatever. And if you know that there is IMAP, you can presume that if you have access to that data, you can access it over whichever protocols are supported. So you can use IMAP or JMAP or whatever else is available if you have that scope token. And so it's an open question of whether this should all be in one document or whether we have this as a profile of OAuth and then a separate thing that kind of pulls it all together, says you use this profile with these scopes, and then you have an interoperable mechanism. So that's the very brief overview of it. So what I would like to do is see if we can get support within this group to adopt this, and also if anyone is keen to work on it as well, happy to have people come along and help with that. So I'll open the floor for questions at this point, I think.
Christina.
Ben, I think, Ben, you were first in the queue.
Was he there? Okay. Ben, go ahead.
I'm happy to yield to speak after.
Say that again, Ben.
I said I'm happy to yield and speak after.
Okay. Christina.
Oh, sorry. Tony Nadeline just told me to be nice, so I consider that a compliment. Sorry. So I just have a bit of an experience of, trying to profile things, writing documents. They try to combine different specifications to give it guidance. And what we've learned is it's kind of important / hard to define based on what you're calling the profile. So that, because once you define one profile, the more profiles are going to come up. And that's a little bit unclear for me for this document. Like, what is your target audience? Like, why you chose, like, why there's no depop mandated, for example, right? Like, why, like, what are the criteria that you chose a specific set of these OWASP related specifications is somewhat unclear. Like, for example, why is DCR there, for example, right? Like, that might increase the barrier for some. So yeah, that's basically the question.
Yeah, it's specifically for native clients, I guess. So actually one thing I didn't mention is the intention is that you can only register a redirect URI that's localhost or a, I can't remember what it's called, like com.fastmail, not an actual URL, because the risks are much higher with a web client. Just being able to say anyone can immediately get a thing where if a user clicks through, they get grant access. Whereas if you've had to download and install something locally, then it could always just fake a web browser anyway if it wanted to phish you to log in. So that's the intention in terms of target audience, is things like your mail or calendar app or anything like that that's running locally on your device. And so the reason Depop's not mandated is because Depop is only defined to work with HTTP, and the intention is for this to work with quite a few protocols that are not HTTP based. So we can't just mandate you must use Depop across everything.
I would like to see that written down in a sense that like I was now looking for like answers to like quite arbitrarily 3 questions I picked, but more like is the CAT, for example, level of security you're looking for, like FAPI and Affinity Connect, for example, or is it more like the deployment model you're looking at? Like, is this like a profile that's ideal for native apps? Versus web apps, like like things like that. I think that should be made like absolutely clear.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Christina. Hey, Ben first.
Hi, I'm Ben Buksch. I'm 20 years developer on Thunderbird, and I've been involved with 4 implementation of OAuth, specifically in mail clients, including the one in Thunderbird. And I agree with this general direction of this draft. We need something like this. The direction is good. It's good intentions. I have huge reservations about the dynamic client registration on multiple levels. First, generally, this client ID that OAuth requires has been a major problem for implementing new clients. I'm trying right now to register with Google and Microsoft, and it's been pretty much impossible. Dynamic registration is supposed to fix that, but I'm not sure that it actually will. It seems fairly unproven because there's no current implementations that I know of. Not a single email client that I know of that is well known implements this. I don't know any provider which implements this. So there is not much experience in how this works. And looking at the spec of the dynamic registration, there's a lot of red flags there. For example, it's optional. The dynamic registration could be optionally requiring a login. I need an access token in order to do the dynamic registration, which is a catch-22, because then I'm back to registering. Then there is a JWT thing that is required. It's not clear whether an operator would block then clients. And this whole business, I don't really know why we need this. And sorry, I don't really see why we would need that. I would propose something much simpler. This will probably make everybody cringe in the room, but I would just define a well-known client ID, calling it open, OPEN, and the clients just connect with that. And because then we're basically on the same level as what we're doing right now with IMAP when we log in with username and password. That's not worse. And we are avoiding this whole business that Google or any other provider might block their competitors.
So, I mean, a few things with that. Firstly, the reason it's not implemented in email clients or servers is the whole chicken egg problem. You wouldn't implement it if you didn't have anyone else to support it. And that's kind of the purpose of having a spec like this that everyone can, agree on, and client providers can say, we're going to implement this. If you support that as well, you will get support. It's actually very simple if you look at because it's been in the profile very much restricted in how it's used. It's basically just submit a static JSON object that contains your information to the server. The server will return a client ID. That's basically it. The server may choose, as I said, to ignore that. If it just wants to return open to every client, it can do that. But it gives it information it might find useful in terms of presenting to the user, its authorization dialog. Now, Obviously, it's, that information can be faked, but as I said, if nothing else, it's very useful as a service provider to be able to track down issues if you find that, these client IDs are finding this problem. Actually, it's all this client, and I've got information from that registration to go talk to the developer and solve that issue. I think either that or the opposite, which is the client metadata, the one Aaron was talking about at yesterday's meeting, where you use a URL as the client ID, and the URL can be used to fetch that registration data. That's another possibility. I think there's pros and cons to each, but I think one of the two is very much worthwhile. Aaron?
Go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, I guess more of a meta question for the group here.
Sorry, can I have a follow-up on this? Sorry, can I have a follow-up on this? I'm still not clear what the purpose would be, because it would seriously complicate the implementation of an email client. Already OAuth today is very complex. That would add a number of additional steps, a number of protocols, and I don't see a value. If every client can always get a registration, why do the extra step? I don't see the value of it. If it's just about finding out which client it is, there's other means how to do that. We can just use the user agent, for example, and we can define that the user agent should be in a certain form, and then you have the same kind of information, and you save yourself all these round trips of keeping registering and failure reasons. And my objective is to make it working reliable, and that seems to be introducing quite some risks here in things that can fail. So I don't see the value based on the effort that we need to make, and the value, I don't see this balance here.
I mean, firstly, I don't think it is adding all this complexity. Is that it has said one HTTP request with a JSON object that's probably static within the client, and it gets back a value. That's it. And I think that information there often you will use for things like the authorization flow. Like you often use the name of the app to say this is the app requesting it, and that's more useful, more user friendly, and I think also can be more reliable than the user agent headers in terms of making sure there's a consistent way of associating which clients making the requests.
This is Hannes. It sounds like we would need to look at some of the details, because dynamic client registration also has a couple of different features. And so if you, for example, if you don't include any, let's say, software statements, etc., the dynamic client registration is like you request something, you get it back, and then it comes out of basically based on nothing, kind of. And if that's the mode of operation, then something that Ben said, like then you just mint some client ID based on whatever is probably roughly equivalent to running dynamic client.
Security-wise, yes.
Yeah.
It's
So,
not doing security.
Sorry, Aaron said I could jump the line.
Okay.
The issue here, so I totally get that perspective from the client side, but if a mail provider is going to allow any random client with no security to show up and start accessing the person's mail based on the user's consent, they're really going to want that client ID to have a very unique, to be instance specific, so that if it starts doing something untoward, they can kill it, right? And so some of this, it's not just about what is simple for the clients to implement, but the mail providers are probably going to be fairly concerned about what's happening, because there's a boatload of PII in people's mail.
Yeah, that's the type of discussion we obviously want to have in the group. And in general, before I hand over to Aaron, it was years ago when we looked at email and the interaction with OAuth. Back then, I remember Thorsten Loderstedt worked on this. We published an RFC on that topic. So it's probably a good idea to revisit what was done back then and have a look at that. And so you're very welcome, Neil, and also Ben, and others from that community, to look at that work again and see whether we can, given that some years have passed, whether we can make a difference now, whether we can improve the state of the art.
And that was kind of
Which documents is that? Again, so yeah, if you can share that on the mailing list, that'd be great.
Well, and that was
All right.
really what I wanted to ask here is, this is I think we're going to see more and more of this kind of pattern of there's a community that wants to use OAuth in a certain way based on constraints that they have, which are different from other communities. And where is the best place for that work to happen? Is it in the OAuth group? Is it in the working group that that community defines their protocols in? Is it important to involve the OAuth group in those discussions? Like, do we want to create profiles for these different uses? Given that, like Neil was saying, there isn't anything new to find in this draft. It's saying how to assemble OAuth building blocks and why these ones were chosen.
Yeah.
And like, there are several examples of these kinds of documents now already.
So the answer has varied over time. So if I recall it correctly, back then we said that we would do that in, actually I don't even remember, but in the SIP case, which you have been working on,
Right.
that was done in a different group and sort of with the review from the OAuth working group. But I think, like, depending on the appetite for Neil and Ben and others, we can definitely sort of work together and figure out what the best place would be, where there's the best expertise to address those issues. So I think it's basically also on us to have more conversation with you guys and then to sort of like get the relevant players together and maybe we could do an interim, a virtual interim meeting to get that discussion going and get more people involved. I think that would be ideal, right?
Yeah.
This is sort of a discussion starter with what we have here. And so thanks a lot for contributing that work and for making us aware of it.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you.
That's good suggestion, Hannes. We can schedule an interim in the coming few weeks, month, whatever, right? Okay, we're out of time here. Thanks, Ben. I think that to answer the question, the call for adoption question, I think it's premature, but let's keep that discussion going. Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Okay, Leif.
No.
Okay, I can. Okay, do you wanna? Did you join?
Or you can flip for me, it's fine.
Okay. Let's do that maybe. Where's Leif? Leif. I think it's.
Is it okay? Live.
There you go. You have control. You want to share?
Cool. This is the, I can only see.
There you go.
There we go. Perfect. All right. So this isn't my work. This is Giuseppe. I think he might be online, but not necessarily awake.
Mhm.
So, go easy on me and on him. All right. So status attestation. So this is for checking status of digital credentials. Like if you think of status lists as the CRLs of digital credentials, this is the OCSP. Right? This is a way to like do a live check of the status of digital credential. And the idea here is, of course, that like the relationship between the holder and the issuer may require a different security context than you may need in order to do a status check. So you could actually do a status check with the identity of the wallet, but not necessarily with the identity of the user. And that's why this could get a little bit easier. And that's kind of the motivation of why you actually want this, right? You could maybe think of, well, what do you actually need this? You could just do short-lived credentials and just keep issuing credentials instead. But the idea is that the credentials might actually need to be user-bound in higher LOA. Anyway, so this is kind of this sort of a picture of the intended flow. Has anybody in the room read the draft? Hands up. Show of hands, like some, all right? So there's a bit of review, all right. All right, so some review, all right. So the idea is that you get a credential from an issuer, the holder turns back to a well-defined, typically metadata status request, status endpoint. You request status for the credentials you're holding from the same issuer, and the idea is that you could actually do like multiple status requests in one go, in one request. In one protocol flow for all of the credentials you're holding for from a particular issuer for a holder, and so the non-dashed arrow in this picture is what is being specified in this draft, and the idea, of course, is that the holder can actually do this essentially in the background. Your wallet can keep updating status for the credentials it's holding. So there are a couple of examples. Essentially, you're providing a hash over the credential as a key to the issuer, and the issuer can go look up that key in its internal database of stuff it's issued and respond with the status of that. Right now, there's a pull request we're working on to extend the semantic of what a status is. Right now, initially, it was thought that maybe we only needed to specify things like revoked or non-revoked, right? But this is being extended to be a little bit more general. We don't know exactly where that's going to land yet, but it will be done in the short while. And I think this is where Giuseppe has to correct me, but I think when we're done with that PR, we're going to ask for adoption as a working group document. So an example of like the request response flow, you're basically listing a bunch of SHA-256 hashes and getting status objects back for those credentials from the issuer. There is those of you who have read the VC document, there's a picture in that VC document of the classical sort of three-party model where you have holder, issuer, and verifier. And in that picture, there's a link between the verifier and the status service. That is not how it would work in this case, right? In this case, the communication is between the holder and the status service, and the status service is associated with the issuer. I don't know if this kind of makes sense to see, but this is like stolen from the document. There is an open issue about the use of depop and proof of possession in general in the draft, and I think that is also something we're looking to resolve before going for a working group adoption. I think one of the things that is being discussed is kind of how do we actually communicate status back. Right now, the draft basically says that there are two kinds of responses, error responses and status responses, and error responses are used to communicate when the status is somehow negative, right? When it isn't fulfilling the status. That is a little bit sort of iffy in my view, because like errors maybe should be used to communicate when something's actually gone wrong with the protocol. But stuff like this is being worked out. There are actually, I think I covered this already. And I actually think I covered this. This is basically what we're working on right now. The depop issue and more detailed status in PR 61. Actually think that's it. So does anybody have questions about this?
Yeah, you have a number of people in the queue there.
All right, well,
Oh, yeah.
There
Yeah.
it is.
Mahmoud?
Go ahead.
Mahmoud.
Mahmoud Al-Khreishi
Oh,
here.
there you go. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Two questions for you. You mentioned that you're going to be working on multiple statuses.
Mhm.
Is that a situation where a credential may exist and have multiple statuses at the same time,
Yeah.
such as suspended and revoked, something like that? And is that going to be an array of statuses, or is that going to be, you can be one of, right?
I think that's an excellent question. I think you should comment on PR 61 to clarify that, what your requirements are. Right now, I think the sense of the authors is that you have one status at a time, and that if you wanted to represent multiple statuses, the combined semantic would have to be described in a status, right? Because it can be very, very dangerous to introduce sort of multiple statuses in an array and have the client consume that in a sensible way. What does it actually mean to be revoked and suspended at the same time, right? So I think the safe response is to say, well, it can be one status, and you have to define the semantic of the status.
When you say you, who do you mean?
Whoever defines the semantic of
The
the
issuer?
status. Exactly, the
Okay.
issuer. Yeah, exactly.
And the second question is about, can I check the status after consuming? So if I take the credential at now and I get the status from you now, how can I verify the status a month from now and check that it was valid at that time?
And in this case, you're the verifier?
Yes.
Well, the verifier doesn't actually do this, right? It's the holder that actually pulls the status, right, and provides it to the verifier.
Yeah, but
Right.
the verifier needs to check the status of a credential at a point in time, right?
Yeah, but all right, Ori is jumping in. You're part of the author team, so you know.
Sorry.
If
Sorry to cut
Yeah.
Q, but I can answer just a bit of
Yeah.
that. When you get these status assertions, they're an arbitrary status assertion of fresh claims from the issuer, and they have extra validity information around them as well, like a issuance time and an expiration time. So as a verifier who's seen several presentations of these kinds of credentials, I might have seen some assertions that a credential wasn't revoked, or that some additional information had changed since the credential was issued at a time in the past. I might see new ones over time. So each of them each status assertion has a validity period attached to it. That's it.
Exactly.
Christina.
Thank you. I personally not a big fan of a model where the wallet fetches the status list, but knowing the authors, I've given up on the idea of trying to persuade them not to do it. So my comment is, there is a draft that achieves, different mechanisms, but there's a draft that achieves the same thing inside the OWASP working group, the status list. Unfortunately, I don't think Paul or Christian or Tobias are on the call. I would like this work item to progress in a way that is not confusing, in a way that doesn't cause confusion between those two documents. I've already been in enough discussions where like existence of both approaches has caused controversies, discussions, confusion. So either, I don't know, just as a suggestion, maybe it is worth actually having them in the same document with a section that very clearly, outlines when to use this approach, and that combines multiple mechanisms without reinventing endpoints, without reinventing claim names, whatnot. That will, I think the existing status list draft is more advanced. That would slows it down, which, as one of the implementers in the space, I would not want to see. But I think it is worth considering, given the benefit of preventing confusion. Like as it is, I would be pretty not in favor of having these two drafts separately within the OWASP working group.
So I guess my response to that is that there are, for the same reasons that CRLs and OCSPs both exist and are used, These two approaches are going to have their sort of respective uses and their valid use cases. I don't think it's. I think it's if you're trying to like avoid confusion in OAuth, like that ship sailed a long time ago. So let's not worry about it for this.
Okay, Giuseppe.
Hey, hello. Thank you, Leif, for the presentation, and all of you for the comments. I have designed this solution, and also with the help of Leif, Ori, Steely, and other authors, to answer to a requirement, a requirement we have to avoid the airline party to monitor the status of a credential over time, even outside of the scope of the user authentication. This was something driven by a requirement, a privacy requirement. At least from my position,
Giuseppe,
Maybe-
you still there?
He may have fallen asleep. Giuseppe.
I think we lost that. I
we,
mean,
we can't hear him. Okay, John, do you want to go ahead?
Sure.
Go back to Giuseppe.
I just wanted to say, I mean, I will try to fill in for what I think Giuseppe was going to say, is essentially that there are good reasons for, at least in our opinion, for having this as a complement to status lists. There are situations, for instance, where status lists will grow to simply be too big, right, to be manageable. And in that case, like an OCSP-like response will be just scale better. Right?
Well, this is, I think, this is something I mentioned earlier. Is like we are redefining the BKX revocation mechanism. This is OCSP.
Yeah, and
we don't call it OCSP.
Kind.
And
but I
and
will.
and that's okay.
I agree with Richard Barnes from like 2 IETFs ago, and he said, let's just lean into it and whatever. Yeah.
Where's Richard? Oh, here. Okay, he woke up.
There he is. But anyway, John, I think maybe
Yeah,
John.
John. Go ahead, John.
So I have the deepest skepticism about status lists. So I think this is useful. There are some things that we're going to have to be careful of, that there is a potential, depending upon how the wallet implements this, there's a potential timing correlation. This doesn't stop issuer verifier correlation. It's probably, most of the verifiers are going to want this information stapled somehow. So that's one question is the stapling methodology included in this draft, or are you expecting to do a different draft for stapling?
I mean, that maybe should be a question we ask Giuseppe. My personal opinion, it should go in this draft. I mean, I think it should go in this draft. I mean, there's no reason to keep profiling this. I think it should be something.
So I would agree that it should go in this draft. We also need to consider this, especially if it's going to be validated by the verifier, then we're kind of limiting ourselves to SDJWT or something that's plausibly deterministic. Once we get into zero knowledge proofs where you have blinding that goes on over the thing that is being presented, they can't recreate the hash. So this is kind of format specific, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but we have to sort of acknowledge that up front, or he's kind of shaking his head in a random way.
I mean, we don't know what JWP are going to look like, right? So,
but one tends to suspect things with blinding probably won't, by design, be able to generate the same hash.
Maybe not. No.
Well, if it does, then we haven't solved issuer verifier correlation.
Exactly.
Atul.
Hi, Atul Tulchibagole. Maybe I missed it, but is there a way for the requester to be authenticated when it gets the it requests the status and gets back the answer.
Yeah, I actually believe that's in the current version of the draft. It may not be well enough specified, and you should definitely like provide some feedback on that if you're not finding it clearly specified enough.
Okay.
But yeah.
Thanks.
Hi, Justin Richer. So I think it's important to, in terms of differentiating this from status lists, that both this and status lists violate the core privacy tenets that are promised by the SSI folks in very different ways. And choosing your violation is going to be very important to the ecosystem. This leaks credential use to the issuer. Status list leaks credential status over time to the verifier. Both of those are things that we were told we would never have to worry about if we just moved everything to SSI. Clearly, the real world doesn't like those promises.
Correct.
So I think that in basically, if we are to go down both the the CRL and OCSP reinvention road, then I think we need to be very clear in situating these things. What are the security properties they give us? What are the privacy properties they give us? Because I think that is what's going to fundamentally differentiate what people are going to want to use in these different environments. I think a lot of the performance is going to be comparable in a lot of ways, but it's really going to boil down to like, what are the properties that this is giving you when you're choosing between them?
There is definitely an element of picking your poison when it comes to like performance. It's either you get it this way or that way, but
you pay it in a different spot,
right?
though.
Exactly.
Right
now, in the status attestation draft, there is at least in my mind a credible attempt to writing a good privacy consideration section, and everybody should review that and see whether that meets your expectations, for instance, Justin, about this, because you make a good point, right? And maybe we should have the same kind of sort of words in the status list.
We absolutely should, but I'm saying go beyond just the privacy considerations and have this be in the framing of where this document makes sense for application. Sure. It's hard to put that in a soundbite nugget, but no, I think it would be worth it for both of these.
I like what you said, Justin. But we need to keep in mind that the best privacy consideration section will not make the privacy issues go away. So
it's just making it clear.
Just talking nice about it, but
it's just making it clear, right?
Richard,
you get Giuseppe is back, maybe?
Yeah, Giuseppe. We don't have too much time though, Giuseppe and Richard, so let's keep it short.
Yeah, very short. Two small points. The first one is the status assertion. First of all, proof to the wallet instance which credential got revoked, and therefore hints to the wallet instance that the credential that it holds might be revoked. So this is a very interesting, simple feature, because in our minds, the wallet instance needs to know, and the citizen must be aware if the credential they have are revoked. The other point is that we have implemented it in Italy. We are in stage with a small group of citizens, and this population will grow significantly before the end of this year. Therefore, this is why we should call for the adoption as soon as possible. Thank you.
Richard.
So I'm mainly here because my name was invoked, and so like the elder gods, I emerged from the deep.
You woke up then?
We took your name in vain.
Yeah, exactly. This is your penalty. So I think it's absolutely fair to lean into reinventing the PKI, and like it's important as you're doing it to reinvent the modern PKI, not the PKI of the 1990s. But I think we're doing that. Like the great news is like what I'm seeing here is like we're doing that. We have much better handle on privacy properties than PKIX ever did, right?
Yeah.
We're incorporating those lessons learned. The only suggestion I had here is that like I really enjoyed Justin's comments about the trade-offs, and like it might be useful just to make like instead of having mechanism A and mechanism B for revocation separately, just to like do them together in one document overall on revocation, and here's the modalities and the trade-offs next to each other.
I mean, I think that's a question for the working group chairs and for the ISG when we get to that point, when we get to the point of actually asking for adoption here, right? And that's maybe one more revision away. Giuseppe, would you agree?
Absolutely.
Maybe.
Absolutely.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know if you can hear me. Yeah, I agree. Absolutely.
Yeah. All right.
And then, and I would be particularly happy if we would actually reference the other work, because we have repeatedly been not referencing existing work, but we don't do ourselves a favor.
You want us to do recursive normative referencing between the status list and status attestation so we can look up the RFC
no,
editors queue?
I want to reference the work we are essentially replicating. I think
informative
informatively, because if we I've seen it numerous times. If people change the name of a technology, they suddenly disconnect themselves from what happened in the past. They don't take the feedback into account because they think, and they talk this into them, that they have actually invented something new. Rant over.
Brian.
Thanks for coming. special guest. Oh.
I had it.
I'm really sorry. I've had trouble with the calendar all week. It's only Tuesday.
Don't worry.
Okay. Only 10 push-ups. That's it. No. That's it.
I appreciate all the good humor for it. I feel like a real something.
No, that's
all right. And thanks for adjusting things. Thanks, Peter, for helping me, and all the people that have messaged me that I was dead and or otherwise. I'm going to see if I can do this. OAuth identity and authorization chaining across domains on behalf of my co-authors, many of whom's names I cannot pronounce, so I will not try. But uh-oh, did I do that?
No.
I'll share it from here.
Not my fault for a change.
Okay. Do you want to go back here? Do you want me to hand you the control? What do you want? Are you awake?
My connection wasn't very good on the bus coming from Kitsilano here. See if I can reestablish it. True story. Yeah, can I do it now?
Yeah, try. I thought it did. Yeah. No,
yeah, it's not
this
working.
one.
No, we're
Okay.
one. I'll just ask you to do it.
Okay, that's
all right.
fine.
So next slide.
Yep.
Hey, you may have seen this slide before. A rough agenda for the document I just talked about. We're going to talk a little overview, refresher of the content, changes since last time, open issues and questions, and of course, next steps. There's a lot of open issues and questions, so we'll get to that. This is actually a picture from Vancouver in the background here. This was one of my abstract phase, but it is legit Vancouver. Next slide, please. So a little rough overview in the form of an ASCII art picture. What this document does is describes a mechanism intended to preserve identity information and federate the authorization across trust domains using the OAuth 2 framework. What it really does is compose and describe the usage of two existing RFCs that do individual pieces of this. The first piece is actually refers to some other work in progress, but we mentioned the authorization server discovery here. That also didn't exist at the time of writing at least some of these. But what we're talking about is allowing some client in domain 1 ultimately to access protected resources in domain 2. And by 1 and 2 here, I mean, of course, A and B, because I misread it. One domain talking to the other one. And what happens is we describe a local token exchange between the client in the first domain using the token exchange RFC to exchange something it has, some token. Oftentimes this token is a token it's received from the outside world, and it's acting as a resource server itself and is doing a local exchange and passing it along, but it's not necessarily that. Something exchanged for a JWT-based authorization grant that it in turn presents using RFC 7523, which is the JOT authorization grant framework or something. Sorry, it was a long run too. I ran after the bus. Presents that to the authorization server in domain B, and Exchange receives an access token, that it can use to access protected resources in domain B. All these pieces exist in various other RFCs, but they are not maybe well known. I get a lot of questions about them. People don't know they exist or don't understand how they work. That's probably because they were written poorly. I take responsibility for a lot of that. What this document does is not really describe or define a lot of new stuff. That's why I use this clever strike through here to say we're just describing things, but describes the composition of these different pieces to be put together and used in a way that actually achieves something that people are trying to do, which is this cross-domain authorization and identity. Do we stop using the word chaining? Anyway, chaining, yes. Next slide, please. So of course, we last met in Brisbane. It's a beautiful place. Here's a photograph of it. What's happened since then or at then? Could I have the next slide, please? One thing that did happen in Brisbane is one of our co-authors, Kelly, presented on this concept to the Whimsy group because I and he and a number of other people feel that this concept is relevant to the work that they're doing in that group, and that group is meeting tomorrow morning at 9:30. I might be there on time. This time's on. And there's a lot of overlap in concepts, cross-pollination, and so forth. So I wanted to bring that up. So that did happen. We're sharing ideas and concept and so forth. Next slide, please. So what have we done in draft 2, which was released right before Brisbane in July of 25? We removed a recommendation to not use RFC, that's token exchanges, requested token type. That's a good double negative there, but we had some wording in there that was basically unnecessarily suggesting against the use of something that some other derivative work of this felt would actually be useful. So we dropped that restriction, made a lot of sense. And we corrected a discrepancy between the alphabetic numbering of a diagram and the text in the resource acting as a client example. I would like to thank Dean for pointing this out. These are obviously some pretty trivial changes. We didn't get a lot of work done. It happens sometimes. Next issue. So looking at the open issues and requests to be pulled, we've got a few things, adding some sender constraining mechanisms, recommending a media type. I'm looking at you again, Aaron. I don't actually know what to do with this. I think we need to do something and or close it, but put it on the list.
Use multiple pluses.
Oh my God, yeah. You might be right. Whether we should allow depop, that's actually really similar in sender constraining. Describe and give examples of what kind of tokens a client would exchange. Actually, this is related to the first point I was making. It's really right now left up to in the open. Like the assumption is that the originating client has something that it can use to kick off this exchange and exchange it. Aaron here, I believe, was suggesting we actually describe some of those things and give a little detail. I think you're probably right. Wonder if someone would do that. Or we can at some time, and add a use case to the appendix. I believe this is Peter. This is fun now, calling out all the people that were wondering where I was just a few minutes ago. Thanks again for your patience and adjustment. Anyway, and then there's an open pull request basically relating to these two items that are about depop, sender constraining, key constraining, whatever you want to call it. And that turns out to be an interesting thing. Could I have the next slide, please? So I've spent a lot of time working on sender constrained, pop tokens, and so forth. And I felt this photograph was really pretty illustrative of a number of things. It's both terribly self-indulgent and sort of reality inducing as well. Here you can see a photograph that I took of Aaron standing on stage presenting that contains a photograph of me talking to Dr. Fett while, you get that, Aaron? Thank you. I'll expect to see this later. About beginning to speak about what I called in a presentation depop and the burden of proof. And it was a little bit of a play on words here with burden, but trying to emphasize the heavy load that it is to carry that and how difficult it is actually to arrive at consensus around making that actually work in reality and in specifications like ourselves. So while the request to add it to this draft is absolutely reasonable, it turns out to be rather difficult. And the other one thing I wanted to mention about this reality side and sort of self-indulgent is I, as you all know, like to consider myself a bit of a photographer. I would like you to note my thumb or forefinger here covering part of the lens in the picture. I'm a skilled tactician. So on that burden, yes, one corner vignette. Next slide, please. So before this stuff kicked off, Kelly said he was going to work on this whole thing, and it got my cackles going. I was like, wow, that's really hard. Let me try to jot down really quickly some of the areas where I think it might be hard, and here are the things you need to think about. So what I did was dump that into one of those issues, and all I've done here is copy out the text from one of those brain dumps of the issue into the slides and tried to highlight the point in the flow where it actually makes sense. This is all about where and what would need to be considered in the concept of sender constraining key binding tokens in the context of this. And the first thing that needs to be considered is the initial token exchange, where the client in domain A calls out with some token to token exchange and expecting to get something back. And what we have here is that we need to think about checking the binding, if it exists, on the inbound token of that token exchange. So there's the subject token that's presented there that may be sender constrained. And if that is the case, then presumably that binding needs to be checked, whether it's MTLS or depop. Those are the only two defined mechanisms, but they would need to be checked and enforced. In many cases, this might not even be possible, depending on the deployment itself. For instance, the very common case that people like to bring up around this, and we talk about a little bit in the document, is the case where this client is actually a resource server acting as a client. It's taking an inbound inbound sender constrained token from the outside world, exchanging it with its AS in order to get a token suitable for its backend services. Might be a transaction token, actually not in this case. It's exchanging it for one of these, excuse me, I lost my train of thought. But in that case, it's impossible to actually check the sender constraint on that because it's the client way upstream that actually holds the key, not the resource server. So you don't want to, you can't, it's impossible to do it. There are cases where you might want to, but trying to describe and define this, it's a little tricky, hard to be done. I didn't offer any solutions here, just point out the problems. Next slide, please. So the problem, the next piece is you need to consider binding the token returned from token exchange. So the request itself, this one, could have been MTLS or have a depop header. And it's kind of implied per the standards. Both of those specs say, hey, these binding mechanisms are applicable to any type of request, any grant type request to the token endpoint. So in theory, if something comes in here that has one of these binding mechanisms sort of on the context of the request, theoretically it's implied that the return token should be bound, but it really maybe only applies to access tokens. I don't know, it's a little fishy, so that should be described. And the return JWT itself, the one that's going to be used as an authorization grant, could be bound with the respective CNF claim, just the same way that you normally would an access token, but embedding it in the CNF claim there. And method, meaning either, I think the certificate hash or the JWK hash. And all this is maybe kind of implied by the standards, but it's certainly not explicitly written down anywhere. And your mileage may vary on interpretation. Next slide, please. And then so the next thing would be, this is the cross-domain call where that client has now obtained this cross-domain JWT. It's using it in this authorization grant. You need to check here, the receiving authorization server needs to check the binding on the inbound token, we call it assertion in this, of the access token request. Our names are tough. The request itself could be MTLS or have a depop header. This is also kind of implied by standards, but it really leaves a lot to the imagination, and it can be checked against the CNF claim of that JWT authorization grant. The presence of the CNF claim itself might, in some worlds, be sufficient to say, hey, this thing is a bound token and you have to require checking the binding on it. I will say that some implementations I know about would just ignore the CNF claim, and there's a whole world of understanding about what was written and what's supposed to be ignored. And I think it would be unlikely to expect most implementations to reject 7523 authorization grant assertion with a CNF claim that's not bound, because a lot of them just aren't aware of its possible existence and would likely ignore it. Probably not all, but a lot. So maybe a new grant type here would make sense to clearly convey the intent that this thing is bound, and also just from sort of a naming and aesthetics perspective, using the currently defined grant type for it, which says JWT bearer for a non-bearer thing, is a little bit awkward. Justin, I know you've taken issue with us doing the same thing in other contexts in the past. Here, I think it probably makes sense to define something new. But again, this was just sort of off the top of my head. Next slide, please.
That's the next slide.
That is? Geez, they all look the same. Binding that resultant access token. This part, I don't know. Obviously, the request itself could have had a header, a depop header, or an MTLS connection. Would have had to have it for the previous thing to be bound in the first place and checked. And this, I think, is also kind of implied by the existing specs. That would say that the token that was issued as a result of this access token would probably also be bound. This part is, I think, a little bit more clear in the underlying standards, and the expectation would be a little bit more clear that it would indeed be bound. But as these things go, it certainly wouldn't hurt to have this part sort of written down more clearly as well. Next slide, please. Oh, wow. Oh, yeah. And then it really gets interesting when in this document we have a conceptual use case where, rather than that client calling its own authorization server, getting back a token, and using that to go cross domain, it calls its own authorization server. Its own authorization server, in turn, becomes the client or acts as the client, or in a sense proxies that request to the cross-domain authorization server, gets the access token on its behalf, and returns that access token to the client itself. It's a nice little proxying trick. It's really cute. It really screws up the concept of sender constraining, because you have all these different entities sort of acting on behalf of a different entity. And how is the authorization server going to prove possession of a key that doesn't hold for a client that just called it? I think I said some stuff in here. Kelly, I think, did some prior work on this. I couldn't find it at the time I wrote it. But ultimately, I think if you want this to actually work and bind the resulting token, you need some kind of like, hey, trust me, this is the CNF that someone else told me they're willing to do. Or maybe they proved it to me, I'm not sure. But either way, ultimately at this step here, you need to have something that's more of a,
So
just trust me.
you
it's
can't
done
say
on-
here because remote people might not see here. So
Okay,
you have
sorry, yeah. D and E. Steps D and E in the context is where the authorization server's trying to make a request on behalf, really for this client, but it is in no way capable of proving possession of key for it, so it gets a little tricky. And I think ultimately the only way to do this, and frankly, whether we really want to do it or not, is some kind of claim probably within the assertion that's going in step D that says, hey, really, please just bind this to this key and trust me, it's cool. I'll do the right thing later. Next slide, please. So next step, I've never been to Dublin. I'm looking forward to it, but I don't have any pictures of it. So I'm jumping ahead to look ahead to Bangkok, because I do have some nice pictures of that.
Okay, Justin.
Thanks all.
Justin Richards. So yeah, the AS acting as client throws several wrenches into the works, but we've seen a similar pattern before with referred token binding. And it's a similar, like, trust me, this is the context I'm going to use it in something else, and there has to be a trust relationship that's defined by policy that allows it to do that. So it's solvable in a way by waving your hands enough.
If I may be a pedantic nerd for a moment, and I know you
Please.
do appreciate that.
Absolutely.
The referred token binding did in fact show proof of possession over a key to the other party. The trust me bit was sort of like, trust me, it's cool to reveal this to the other party. It was like a privacy mechanism. So
okay, so I'm misremembering some of the details there.
and it was
I
a long
thought
time
it was
ago
a
and it's
separate
not deployed and
context.
it doesn't matter.
Right.
But
Token binding's dead. We know that, but okay.
yeah, it was a little bit different. It was actually.
Okay, that's
But
fair.
I'm reasonably sure this concept is not unique to this. But I am not aware of any other like legitimate way to do it than sort of that blind, hey, trust me, please do this. And there's a lot of trust going on here anyway, so it's kind of maybe okay, and that's pretty authoritative. It's kind of maybe okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Brian, thank you for the entertainment. That was nice. And see you all Friday. No worries. No worries. Yeah, it happens. That's fine. Yeah, no worries.
Thank you for adjusting.
Yeah. Happens to everyone. That's fine.
Yeah.